The Scopes trial, formerly known as the State of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes, was an American legal case in July of 1925 in which a substitute teacher, John T. Scopes, was accused of violating Tennessee's Butler Act, which made it unlawful to teach evolution in schools. The trial started in Dayton, Tennessee on July 10, 1925, and lasted for a week. It was nicknamed the Monkey Trial because of the evolutionists' belief that humans are descendants of monkeys. Leading up to the trial, there were many factors that had played a role. Both fundamentalists and evolutionists had already been established and at a disagreement since well before the trial. The theory of evolution, or the belief that all species are related and gradually change over time, had been taught and well known since the Industrial Revolution in the 1860s. It received backlash only when Christian denominations such as evangelists and Protestants rejected any belief regarding the Earth's creation other than what came from the Bible. Important texts that were used by evolutionists were Charles Darwin's books, published in 1859, called The Origin of Species, and in 1871, The Descendant of Man. Both addressed mankind and the belief that humans are descendants of monkeys, stating, "Man is descended from a hairy-tailed quadruped, probably a boreal in its habits and inhabitant of the Old World." And George William Hunter's A Civic Biology, published in 1914, stating, "Evolution is the belief that simple forms of life on Earth slowly and gradually gave rise to those more complex, and that thus, ultimately, the most complex forms came into existence." On the other side of the argument was fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is defined as a form of religion, especially Protestant and evangelist Christianity, that upholds belief in the strict, literal interpretation of Scripture. Fundamentalists believe in the creation story of Adam and Eve, a myth old as time and dating back to Abrahamic religions. Fundamentalists use this as the end-all be-all for information on the creation of humans. People like Billy Sunday and Aimee Semple McPherson were important fundamentalists to the fundamentalist movement. Billy Sunday was a former baseball player turned evangelist in 1896. He was known for his strong views on fundamentalism and the temperance movement. Similarly, Aimee Semple McPherson was an American-Canadian Pentecostal evangelist and fundamentalist. Both McPherson and Sunday were fierce and charismatic leaders for the fundamentalist movement. Most importantly, they added to the circus atmosphere of the 1920s, as well as provide light to the significance of Christianity and the belief of the Bible. The Butler Act started its course on January 21st of 1925. Representative John Washington Butler introduces legislation in the Tennessee House of Representatives calling ban on teaching evolution. The law would prohibit, quote, "any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals," end quote. On January 27th of 1925, Tennessee House of Representatives vote 71-5 in favor of the Butler Act. And on March 13th of 1925, after hours of heated debate, the Senate approves the Butler's bill, 24-6. Finally, on March 21st, 1925, Tennessee Governor Austin Peay signs the Butler Act into law. The Butler Act was the first law in the United States banning the teaching of evolution. On May 4th, 1925, a Chattanooga newspaper runs an item noting that the American Civil Liberties Union is seeking teachers willing to test the Butler Law. On May 5th, 1925, town leaders in Dayton, Tennessee read ACLU's search and want to bring the case to Dayton to bring publicity and help jumpstart the town's economy. They chose to ask a 24-year-old science teacher and football coach, John Thomas Scopes, to bring the case to trial. Scopes agrees, even though he's only taught biology as a substitute. From the beginning, the trial gained a lot of attention from the general public, starting with the two celebrity opponents. Three-time presidential nominee William Jennings Bryan volunteered to present for the prosecution. The politician was a well-known fundamentalist who had created a lot of controversy about teaching evolution prior to the trial. Clarence Darrow, a famous attorney, defended Scopes. He almost backed out of the trial, but changed his mind when he heard Bryan would be on the opposing side. Bryan and Darrow had already battled over evolution and fundamentalism before. After they were both confirmed to be a part of the trial, they immediately began attacking each other in the press.
On May 9, 1925, the grand jury met. The prosecution opened with Chief Prosecutor Tom Stewart asking 7 students in Scopes' class a series of questions about his teachings. They testified against Scopes, saying he taught them that man and other mammals had evolved from a one-celled organism. On July 10, 1925, the Scopes monkey trial began. The Scopes trial pushed Dayton into the spotlight for the first time as people traveled from all over the country to witness the monkey trial. Nearly 1,000 people crowded the courthouse 2 hours before the trial began. The large audience applauded when William Jennings Bryan entered the room. Hordes of people mingled outside the courthouse in a circus-like atmosphere with barbecues, carnival games, and concessions. During the first few days, the two sides went back and forth giving passionate speeches. Darrow's main argument was that the Butler Act promoted one particular religious view and was therefore illegal. Prosecutors soon began arguing about the validity of expert witnesses, people who are allowed to testify during a trial due to having special knowledge of a topic relevant to the case. This gave Bryan a chance to give an extensive speech about the subject. The climax of the trial came when Darrow called Bryan to the stand as an expert witness on the Bible, much to the shock of the rest of the court. Darrow interrogated Bryan on several biblical stories and the validity of interpreting them literally. Bryan was further made to look foolish when he was forced to admit that he didn't know much about science, since the Bible didn't provide any answers. Bryan died in his sleep 5 days after the trial. As the trial ended, Darrow asked the jury to return a verdict of guilty in order that the case might be appealed to the Tennessee Supreme Court. Within 9 minutes, the jury pronounced Scopes guilty and fined him $100. His conviction was later overturned on a technicality, but Tennessee kept the Butler Act until it was finally repealed in 1967. After the trial, Scopes left Dayton to study geology at the University of Chicago Graduate School. He later became a petroleum engineer. Although the fundamentalist won the trial, both sides claimed victory. The anti-evolution movement continued, but fundamentalists got a lot of criticism and ridicule for how absurd the trial was. After the Scopes conviction, high school biology classes began to change drastically. The amount of evolution being taught in public schools decreased dramatically, and textbook publishers and school boards alike became reluctant to include evolution in their curriculum at all. Many publishers removed Darwin's theory of evolution from their books completely. In the months following the trial, Mississippi and Texas passed similar laws to the Butler Act. 22 other states attempted to do something similar, but failed. In Texas, Governor Miriam Ferguson, the first female governor in the South, ordered the state's textbook publishers to cut out, literally, with scissors, the pages containing information about the theory of evolution from all high school biology textbooks. The school board also threatened to fine any teacher using books that hadn't been approved. Evolution didn't reappear in textbooks until the 1940s and later. However, the information was often biased, as textbook authors would frequently include religious quotes following the discussion of Darwin's theory. About 20 years after the trial, a few textbook authors wrote bold statements in support of the theory of evolution, but these books were rarely popular. According to a 1976 law that was revised in 1990, public schools in Kentucky are allowed to teach biblical creation as well as evolution. Although the public image of fundamentalism was damaged from the Scopes trial, it remained a large part of American religious and spiritual life, especially in the Baptist Church, for years after 1925. Although the public image of fundamentalism was damaged from the Scopes trial, it remained a large part of American religious and spiritual life for years to come. This was partially due to important fundamentalists like Billy Sunday and Aimee Semple McPherson. Billy Sunday led over 300 revivals or religious awakenings, considering evolutionism, with a combined attendance of about 100 million people. He brought fire and energy to the fundamentalist movement. Aimee Semple McPherson worked with Sunday and gave sermons speaking on the importance of fundamentalism in the Bible in schools. It's safe to say both McPherson and Sunday closely followed the Scopes trial, as well as rallied behind the idea of the Butler Act that passed the illegality of teaching evolution in the first place. After the events of the Scopes trial, many Christians slowly started to come to terms with religion and science. Although not as prevalent, this debate between God and evolution still continues to this day and will, perhaps, continue on into the future.
Milestones of the century. In 1925, biology teacher John Scopes spiraled to fame in the legal battle that became known as the monkey trial. Whether man was descended from the monkey or just making a monkey out of man was fought in a courtroom that challenged the truth of the Darwin theory of evolution. The existence of man in the prehistoric world was denied, for according to the Bible, life began with Adam and Eve. An atmosphere of carnival invaded the sleepy little town of Dayton, Tennessee, as signs and demonstrations ballyhooed the conflict between religion and science. As the world waited, hundreds jammed the courtroom to see if man's intelligence and belief could be controlled by law. The giants of legal oratory, Dudley Field Malone and Clarence Darrow, defended John Scopes' beliefs before the world. It was John Butler's anti-evolutionary law that prohibited the teaching of any theory that denied the story of divine creation. Assistant to the state prosecutor was William Jennings Bryan, who adamantly crusaded against a scientific and atheistic world. Raised in a devout Christian environment, he believed that any education that destroyed the religious faith could not be endured. William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow fought a battle of words. Calico and coveralls packed the courtroom to protect the faith against the foreigners and to find out what this new evolution was all about. On a hot summer's day in the courtroom, Judge Ralston, whose career had never extended beyond the borders of Tennessee, swore in a jury of farmers. The press and public listened with unprecedented interest as the legal brains of both sides dug deeper and deeper into the conflicting theories of man's heritage. In this bitter legal engagement, the defense fought against the inherent belief and faith that challenged the credibility of science. At the return of the indictment against John Scopes, Ralston, a small-town jurist, became the center of world judicial interest. As the Scopes trial continued, Judge Neal, another renowned jurist, was called to bolster the defense counsel of Clarence Darrow and Dudley Field Malone. Few trials in all the history of the American bar held the interest of the nation. The defense listened caustically as William Jennings Bryan refuted scientific evidence as insidious doctrines, robbing the faithful of their chance for eternal life. In this rare dramatic moment, Clarence Darrow was unable to get this evidence accepted into the record. The result, a verdict of guilty. John Scopes was fined $100. Darwin had lost, and the monkey was on the run. The jury's verdict had removed the fears of man's descendancy from the minds of the people as they returned to a life of virtue and certainty. The monkey trial was a legal carnival to be remembered among the judicial milestones of the century.